Alrighty, so week 4 learn together. My goal last week was to be a little bit ahead of where I was last week. I'm one day ahead. I'm happy with that. Hey, this week, because we're finished section 5, it shouldn't be a big surprise that I want you to take your code from last week and refactor it into objects. And remember, objects are organized, related data, and methods. And so also in addition to that, I want you to add at least one new piece of functionality into your code. Okay, so let me go over my refactor. You can see the code link and I will provide it. One of the really nice outcomes of using objects was that I no longer had to declare global variables. And you might say, well, is that a good thing? Well, in general, if we don't have to do global variables, it's better because then we're um, encapsulating the data into the places it should be versus setting out on the global scope, because it's just a little more hazardous to do it that way. There's a lot of other reasons, but in general, if you can decrease the amount of global variables you have, that's great. So in this case, what I did is I created two player objects, and then I just placed some items into my object, key value pairs. I noticed, and I'd finished I review each section before I do this just to make sure I've got it all. But one thing I noticed is he didn't actually talk about key value pairs, and that's the big thing you'll hear again and again when it comes to objects, so the key and the value. So I set up two objects. I set up an object that was for the game that had some data, but also had the methods, right? So the idea of moving to methods is a really big jump this week. But I just basically, I don't think I created any new functions that I converted into methods. Or I shouldn't say I created anything new. I just converted all my functions from last week into methods. But in this case, I placed them all in this one object related to the gameplay itself. And as I was doing it, I was thinking, I actually could break this out maybe into two objects, one more the play and the other one maybe more the output. But for now, I'm okay with it. Right. So, and again, this stuff didn't change. What did have to change, though, is my references. And that was one of the things that's really good exercise to, remember understanding that this, right? So when we're using this, we're referencing data within this object. And he talks about that it can be a source of like a challenge for new programmers when they see this. I remember when I first saw this, I was like, what is this? Right. And then that's the other thing, is just talking about it creates kind of a challenge. But I did have to change my variable names to reflect the object, right? So where I was updating the games won by the player. Now here's the other thing, and I'll show you this on my actual, when I call it, is that I passed in player, which allowed me to have multiple players. And the way I had the code last week with just functions wasn't really an easy way to do this. But now with the abstraction of objects, it's much easier to do this. Okay. So I can just pass in the player. And then when I do player dot, it refers to that player and that value for that player, but it's abstracted in the function to not determine, or not to declare the variable, just, or the object, just to pass it. And this is an important thing of understanding pass by reference. Okay, so let me go back down and just show you the bottom. So I did set up one function. I ended up with one, and I could have put this in here, but I decided no, for now I'm just going to leave it out because it is part of the game, but it's really playing the game. So I decided, and I could actually, maybe that's what I'll do, is make this a function object. I don't know. Anyway, it's okay if you have one, I suppose. So then in here, I set up some variables. Oh, one thing I did do here that maybe you haven't seen is I called, and RPS is my game, get game selection, right? This is where I randomly select. And then what I did here is because I used the result of whatever that was to make the next call. So instead of doing two calls, method calls, I just actually, um, uh, I didn't chain them together, but I nested them together. So when you look at this, whatever is in here gets called, and then the result of that gets passed into this. Okay, so first it gets the game selection integer, and then it converts that to the actual rock, scissors, paper. Again, I'm using the idea of randomly selecting for the game, and the player, obviously, as we move into after the code review for this first one, because this first one is intended to be a command line app, right? So then I'll not randomly select what the player's doing, that the user will. Okay, so now what I do here is I get the result by calling, and this is where I've added a parameter for player into my game, which is great. And again, the idea of abstraction. And then I run the output with the player and with the result I got here. Okay, so what this so anyway, that's the code. That's the code I wrote. You're welcome to look at it, ask me any questions. I think I went over what I had done that wasn't in there, and it was just basically the idea of nested function calls. Something you'll hear later is called chaining. This is not chaining, but we could actually do some chaining with this example, but I'm not going to. Doesn't make sense unless we're there yet. So anyway, I think this is really this idea of objects and converting things to using objects and methods versus functions, and understanding the way you can place data, so you can have data related and methods related to the whatever you're organizing, is a really important thing to understand conceptually and then to get your code running. Okay. Oh, so let's see. My added function, actually, I think I better work on that. But one thing I would say, what naturally came out of this to add a function is I can add players. So actually, that is a pretty cool thing. So maybe what I'll do is add a player 3, and that gives me a little more stats. Okay, so I think, and you'll hear me talk about this on the week's attendance. I'm getting to where I've thought about the first code review, but now I'm actually going to have to give a little more detail to what you're going to be writing, since we're working so much on our apps here, which is good. It's fine. So the two things left. One is that debugging. So it's never too early. It's never too early to learn about debugging. Let me just show you. And it's good to learn it now when we're just at the command line, because it's a little different, not a lot different, when we actually go run it in the browser. But here's what you can do. If you haven't, and I suspect many of you haven't, on VS Code, you come down to the little bug, debugging, right? And what you can do here is you have to specify what's called a breakpoint. So where you want your code to stop, right? So I'm going to actually, and you can just move your mouse over and you can see the red dot. And when you click the red dot, then you've told the debugger, okay, when you run my code, I want you to stop here. And this is so helpful because watching your code run is really important. Understanding the flow, because it's like, yeah, you wrote it, but understanding the flow might surprise you, but also understanding what comes back. Anyway, let me show you. And the call stack is something we haven't talked about yet, but it is good to know. So if I do this and then I come over to here, the other thing is you can also, before I do this, you can change to where you have the debug console versus the terminal, and I'll show you why that's good. So I'm going to go ahead now and just go ahead and hit start here, right? So what happens is, because I did the breakpoint after I'd run the first game with player 1, I got the output of that, but then there's a halt, because that's what the breakpoint is doing, right? And over here, I can see the local variables that got set up, which is great. I can see my players. I can see my function call, right? I can see my object here. Right, so these are objects, and then this is the function. And you can see that by looking at these. And so what you can do here, and here's really where, it's great, is that you can actually you have now control over what happens next. So you can, and if you leave your mouse, it says you can step into, you can step over. So if I step into gameplay, then of course it's going to come up here, right? But if I choose this option, then it's going to just jump over this function into the next function. But so if you're in something, and I'll show you this when we get to console, why that's helpful, right? Because when you're calling console, it actually ends up calling another file that it opens to show you. To show you that code that you didn't write, but you're using code, so it brings in that code to show you. And this is very common and something you see in any debugger, really, or most debuggers. Okay, so in this case, I'm actually going to step over just so I can show you. So that stepped over, so now I can see the second time it ran. So now I'm actually at the breakpoint where I've run this one. So now here, I'm actually going to say step into this, right? So if I step into this, then it actually steps into this function call. And the line that's highlighted is the line that's about to run. So what you can do here is you can step into that line, right? And then that calls. And by the way, if you watch over here, right, this is all the setup stuff that happens, but over here is my my code called play game, and then play game called get selection, right? So now on get selection, that's where I'm at, right? And also you can put your mouse over things and it'll tell you if those variables have been declared yet or assigned. So I'm going to go ahead and just walk through, right? Now, if I wanted to at this point, I could just say jump over, and that would then bring me back here rather than to run all that code. Because let's say I'm like, you know what, that's not where my error is at. And that's the whole idea here, is for you to be able to find errors in your code, right? Because there's just, again, never too soon to learn. So I'm going to go ahead and actually go into this, right? I'm going to drop through that just so I can see that. And then I'm running it again. Okay. There we go. Cool. So actually, now that I have these two, I can see that these variables, what they declared. So player choice is paper. And then I can see here, that's scissors, right? So that's what came back. And now I'm getting ready to run the game itself. Okay, so I'm actually going to jump over that just because now here's where, and this will happen, is because this output is actually going to call console. Oh, actually, sorry, I should have popped into that. And actually, let me just do that real quick, right? So now, actually, this is good. So if I have a breakpoint here and I have a breakpoint inside of gameplay, which breakpoint's going to hit first? Do you know? Right? So actually, we're still in the code itself because I haven't completed the code running, but I can just go ahead and hit step into, right? So now I'm going to hit here. So in this case, I'm going to jump over, jump out of that. And actually, it's probably not the greatest example because I should have hit stop, right? So this would be stop here. And if I start over, right? So now actually we're back to where, so if I have a breakpoint inside this function and I have a breakpoint in this call, which breakpoint gets called first, the bottom one or the top one, right? And part of that is understanding, right, where your code, how your code is running. And so in this case, it would be here because I ran this function without a breakpoint, and when it ran it, it hit that breakpoint here. So the whole reason I was into this one was actually to bring in console. So what will happen, and you can move this out of the way, is that when you're running a console command, console.log, it's going to bring in the console.js, which is actually kind of cool and good to look around because you might be surprised how much of this code at this point you actually do understand. But if you don't want to spend a lot of time here, what you can do is just jump over this, right? It's like jump over that function, jump over that function, and now we're back. So now we're actually back in here, and now we're actually running the code. And that's why when it comes to console, just jump over, right? Or actually, sorry, step over. So you can look at these. If you hover over, you can actually see this. So anyway, what I want you to do here is, now that you have that, I'm going to give you an article link to a good basic debugging one, because I want you in your reply or to talk about maybe something you learned from doing the debugging, right? Was it helpful to you? Because the better debugger you are, the better coder you are. So here's the last thing is I actually do have the schedule for the code reviews up. Here they are. And somebody asked me, and I definitely want to say this, is if these times don't work for you, reach out to me and let's figure out a time that will. I want to try to work within this wherever possible, but if it doesn't, please let me know. And I talked about at the beginning of, I think the second week or maybe the first one, the idea of how I set these up was times before the actual due date. Sorry, I'm looking at the dates real quick. I gotta look at those before I release this. Anyway, because it looks like they're out of order. I don't know what happened here. I have to go check that because I had them right. I have had that happen with via. Anyway, not your problem, mine, and I'll figure that out before you probably go look at this. All right, so that's it. Have a good week, and I will talk to you soon.